Hamjambo. I want to begin by saying I'm extremely nervous. And because of that, I'll read everything I'll say here. And then I promise I'll go over time. At the African Studies Association conference in San Francisco on October 20th, 2010, I was privileged, like today, to present a paper to a distinguished audience of scholars like you. As usual, English was the main language of the conference. My paper was entitled Ushairi wa Kiswahili katika enzi ya utandawazi, Swahili Poetry in the Age of Globalization. Here I was, in the belly of the beast that the United States was and still is, presenting a paper in Kiswahili, East Africa's lingua franca, to an enthusiastic and highly intelligent audience. How? How was it possible to present in Kiswahili at a scholarly conference in a country that the late Professor Ali Mazrui had stated was particularly influential in the spread of English in the world? A country whose role in the spread of English is enabled, as Mazrui further stated, by its preeminence in the global economy, in science, in aviation, and in films, and so forth. As it turned out, Swahilists had worked diligently to ensure that there were Swahili sessions in a conference of the eminence of the ASA conference, to run concurrently with the sessions conducted in English as a medium. Swahili, the lingua franca of East and Central Africa, was either eating at the same table with English, the Swahili of the world, as the late Mwalimu Julius Nyerere would put it, or it was simply eating breadcrumbs that fell off the English table at ASA. Therefore, my paper, Ushairi wa Kiswahili katika enzi ya utandawazi, found time and space at this concurrent session at the ASA conference in San Francisco. I do recall some other presentations at this concurrent Swahili session. For instance, Professor Charles Bwenge of the University of Florida presented the paper on Swahili language bloggers, while Professor Ndirangu Wachanga of the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater presented on my children's story, Ndoto ya America, which I have since translated as the American Dream. What I felt about Professor Wachanga's interpretation of my book, the uncanny feeling you experience when someone tells you what your book denotes and connotes, opening new vistas of knowledge unknown to you as the author, is a matter for another day. What has remained particularly etched in my feeble mind is the image of an elderly man in a white kanzu, sitting on the front row and fixing his compassionate gaze on me as I presented. I had no doubt in my mind that the Mzee listened with rapt attention as I stumbled along in my baby scholarly steps, theorizing, explicating, and extrapolating upon Swahili poetry in the age of globalization, stuttering, and stopping here and there as I went along. I felt really, really small, insignificant, inadequate, inconsequential, much like Brazil after the 7-0 drubbing at the hands of the mighty Germans at the 2014 Football World Cup. Simply put, I was overawed by the quiet presence in the audience of a preeminent African scholar who had seen it all, had it all, said it all, done it all, and had left his footprints on the sands of time. And yet, the elderly man in the audience didn't in the least display any adversarial expression on his face. He wore a warm, cheerful look on his face. And perhaps because of that, I wasn't completely petrified, not completely tongue-tied. So I went on and on. By now you must have surmised that the Mzee on that front row was none other than the late Professor Ali Alamin Mazrui, in whose honor this conference is being held in his hometown of Mombasa. He had been one of the founding fathers of OSA that sponsors annual conferences, such as the one at San Francisco in 2010, in which I presented. For decades, Professor Ali Alamin Mazrui was a palm wine, as Achebe would put it, with which academic discourse at the African Association Conference was eaten. There was almost always a Maruzian component or segment of the conference, exclusively preoccupied with discussing Mazrui's latest article, book, or ideas expressed in different forums. In my presentation at San Francisco in 2010, when I read the poem Niguse, Touch Me, to illustrate the beauty of Swahili poetry in the era of globalization, I saw Mzee's face light up. He grinned and listened with much more attention. It was a poem from Chembe Chamoyo, Arrowhead, a collection of prison poems written by his nephew, Professor Alamin Muhammad Mazrui, one of the countless intellectuals that the Daniel Arap Moi regime detained without trial for crimes of opinion. Other intellectuals who were detained included Dr. William Tunga, who could not make it to this conference, but was expected, the current Kenyan Chief Justice, Maina Kinyati, Edward Oyugi, Kamoji Washira, Koigi Wamwere, Wanyiri Kihoro, and Mukaru Nganga. In fact, in March 1983, Professor Alamin Muhammad Mazrui was dragged from the classroom at Kenyatta University, where he served as a lecturer and a university's academic union official. He spent more than a year in detention. And his anthology of prison poems, Chembe Chamoyo, of which Niguse is an example, was proof that prison could be a site for writing as well. And so that you have a sense of what Mzee, the senior Mazrui, heard during my presentation then, I will read the poem again here now. Listen. Nitokapo kizuizini, nitamuomba yeyote mwandani aniguse taratibu, pole pole, lakini kwa yakini. Niguse tena, unijuze tena, unifunze tena maisha yalivyo, maisha yaonjavyo na yake ilivyo. Nipo hapa, nimekukabili, niguse tena tafadhali. Niguse, niguse. Now, because of the tyranny of time, I will not read you the translation. This is not the time again for me to rehash the details of my analysis of the poem and how it exemplified the depiction of horrors of political incarceration in a globalized world. How the poet sought solace in poetry, how poetry facilitated the quest for the right to be human again, and so forth. When I was done with the presentation, I went to sit, as before, in my place on the front row, next to the preeminent African scholar. He leaned to my side and whispered in my ear, "Great paper this. Particularly the poetry of your prose in analyzing poetry. Superb," he said. "Make sure Alamin reads this paper." No. Professor Ali Mazrui had not come to the Swahili segment of the conference because there was a presentation of a paper on his nephew, my mentor, and his own mentee. No. Let me add quickly, he was totally unaware of the details of my paper before its presentation, beyond the title and the name of the presenter. He had come because he had a soft spot for Swahili, the language of his hometown of Mombasa. It's a language in which he never wrote. Yet, he was an unyielding defender of this language, defending it theorizing on its past, present, and future. He had elected to follow his heart. And his heart was with and in Swahili. When Ngugi wa Thiong'o had been offered a teaching position at the New York State University, an interesting scenario ensued between the two iconic scholars. Ngugi had given the university tough conditions for accepting the position, which included requiring the university to accede to sponsoring a Kikuyu Jano. Ngugi sought Mazurui's opinion on this. And as was inevitable, Mazurui did not hide his reservation, and instead wrote to Ngugi stating why the choice of Swahili as the medium of the proposed Jano would have been far more practical and preferable. At any rate, given its international spread, there will be more Swahili readers than Kikuyu ones in North America. When the journal, Mutiri, was launched, the Kikuyu translation of Mazurui's response to Ngugi opposing the choice of Kikuyu was published. Although Ngugi's Kikuyu-centric desires were vindicated by New York University, the debate between the two intellectuals had demonstrated dramatically Mazurui's recognition of Swahili as a language of international and intellectual import. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to vilify Ngugi, a man I respect, a man who has inspired me tremendously in my creative writing and academic career. As I speak now, Ngugi is busy writing a preface to my forthcoming English translation of Abdul Latif Abdallah's prison poetry, Sauti ya Viki. Not to mention how he graciously granted me an interview that I included in my latest academic book, Narrating Prison Experience, Human Rights, Cell Society, and Political Incarceration in Africa. This one. So I'm only juxtaposing the contrasting views of these eminent African scholars. Let me reiterate that Professor Mazurui's rich and vast academic publications demonstrate how he was an unyielding defender of Swahili language, defending it, speaking for it and about it, theorizing on its past, present, and future. The books mentioned earlier by other presenters, Swahili State and Society, the Power of Babel, which he co-authored with his nephew, Akesazin Point. Of course, co-authoring is one of the reasons that some people continue to confuse between the late Professor Ali Alamin Mazurui, a political scientist born in 1933, and his nephew, Professor Alamin Muhammad Mazurui, a linguist and literary scholar born in 1948, and who is still alive. Following the passing of the senior Mazurui, I noticed the widespread confusion in the Kenyan public, made worse by the misinformation of a clueless media, including the media house I work for, about the distinction between the two. Many in social media and mainstream media were mourning the living Mazurui, the author of the Swahili masterpiece, Kilio cha Haki, that was once mandatory reading in Kenyan high schools. Therefore, in my tribute to the late Professor Ali Alamin Mazurui, in the newspapers, I was compelled to offer a corrective, which I did also in interviews on radio and television. Now, back to Mazurui and Kiswahili as I move closer to the end. Granted, Professor Ali Mazurui never wrote in Swahili, yet he had ransacked the closet of the English language, as Kwame Appiah would have put it, and used his mastery to advance some of the most erudite and compelling arguments on the place of Swahili in East and Central Africa in general, and the world in particular, and the world in general. He was, in a sense, a successor of Shakespeare's Prospero in The Tempest. No, perhaps more accurately, Ames Cesare's Prospero in his rewriting of Shakespeare in Tempest, a Prospero who learns the master's language and uses the same language to lambast the master. I'm saying perhaps because Professor Al-Mazrui, in my view, may be a reincarnation of Cesar Prospero, who speaks Kiswahili, not Shakespeare's Prospero. And M. Cesar Prospero uses words like uhuru, just like the word kabisa in Achebe's Anthills of the Savannah. Let me now conclude. So I should not conclude. Thank you so much for listening to me.